Okay, let's get into this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into, well, the very early life of someone whose path really changed everything, Siddhartha Gautama. This is before he became the Buddha.
Right. We talk so much about his enlightenment, but the sources actually give us quite a bit about his childhood,
Yeah, exactly. What was going on before all that? What do the sources show us about how the stage was set for that incredible transformation?
It's a really interesting question because there's his royal background, his family, and these pretty striking prophecies right from his birth.
Okay, so our mission here for this deep dive is to really dig into those source details, try to understand that specific environment he grew up in, and maybe pull out the key bits that, show how things were lining up for the path he eventually took.
Let's see what was really happening behind those palace walls.
Yeah, what was going on?
And what's fascinating, I think, is how the very conditions set up for him, maybe with one goal in mind, might have actually pushed him towards something completely different.
Absolutely. Okay, let's set the scene first. Time and place. We're talking ancient India, right? Roughly when?
Around the 6th century BCE, give or take. And the sources place us specifically in the kingdom of Kapilavastu.
Kapilavastu. And where's that now, roughly?
That area is now part of modern-day Nepal. It was the land of the Shakya clan.
The Shakyas. And the family in charge.
That would be King Suddhodana and his wife, Queen Maya. They were Siddhartha's parents. The lineage is pretty central in the texts.
Right. And speaking of his parents, the sources describe Siddhartha's birth itself as, pretty extraordinary, don't they?
They really do. There's this famous legend about Queen Maya's dream beforehand.
Oh, right. The dream.
Yeah, filled with these auspicious symbols like a white elephant entering her side. It's presented as, a sign of how important this child would be.
A white elephant. Yeah, that's definitely not your everyday birth announcement.
Yeah.
And the actual birth.
The sources say it happened in the Lumbini gardens. So away from the palace, under a sal tree. And a really striking detail in many accounts is that the birth was supposedly painless for the queen. No difficulty at all.
Wow. That detail really stands out. A sort of miraculous, effortless birth.
It certainly emphasizes how the sources frame him as, well, special right from the absolute beginning. But the story takes a really sad turn very quickly after that.
This is about Queen Maya, isn't it?
Yes. Tragically, the sources consistently report that Queen Maya died just 7 days after Siddhartha was born.
Only 7 days. Wow. That's incredibly poignant, especially after such a, celebrated birth. So he lost his mother almost immediately.
A huge loss right at the start. The sources then really highlight the role of her sister, Mahapajapati Gautami.
His aunt.
Yes, his aunt. She stepped in, raised him, cared for him deeply, became his mother figure, essentially.
And all this care happened within, as the sources describe it, this incredibly privileged and luxurious setting.
Oh, completely. His early life in the palace is painted as one of immense comfort, luxury, just everything provided.
And what was the king's thinking there? Why create such a bubble? What do the sources say King Suddhodana was aiming for?
They're very explicit about this. King Suddhodana was absolutely determined to shield Siddhartha from any kind of suffering, any hardship at all.
Why, though? Just protectiveness.
It was more than that. His big ambition was for Siddhartha to follow a worldly path, become a great king, a universal monarch, they call it, and, secure the family line, keep the kingdom strong.
So the luxury wasn't just comfort, it was actually a strategy to influence his destiny.
Exactly. And the sources give details about how far this went, like different palaces built just for different seasons, so he'd always be perfectly comfortable.
Seriously, different palaces.
Yeah. And they say the king surrounded him constantly with pleasant things, music, dancing, beautiful sights, fine foods, and deliberately kept anything potentially upsetting, like old age or sickness, completely out of view. A very, very controlled environment.
That sounds like an almost unbelievable level of, environmental control.
It does. The picture painted is just pure worldly pleasure, sensory delight, nothing to disturb him.
Hanging over all this carefully crafted perfection was something else, right? This prophecy. The sources mention wise men examining the baby.
Ah, yes, the prophecy. This is really the core tension. The sources say 8 wise men were called in. They saw certain marks on the infant prince.
Marks. Like birthmarks.
Auspicious marks, yes. And based on these, they made this prediction. But it had 2 possible outcomes. A fork in the road, basically.
Okay, what were the 2 paths they saw?
Path 1. If the prince stayed in the palace, surrounded by pleasure, never seeing suffering, then he would become that great Chakravartin, that universal monarch, the powerful world ruler.
Which is exactly what the king wanted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But path 2 was very different. If the prince did encounter suffering, the texts often mention seeing an old person, a sick person, and a dead person, then he would renounce everything. His palace, his future throne, all of it.
And become.
Become a great spiritual teacher, a Buddha, an enlightened one.
Wow. Okay, so the king's intense efforts, the shielding, the palaces, that was all a direct reaction to this prophecy, trying to prevent path two.
Absolutely. The sources are clear that King Suddhodana was deeply, deeply worried about that second possibility. Every single thing he did, building walls, providing distractions, keeping suffering out, was designed to stop Siddhartha from ever seeing those triggers, to lock him onto the path of being a king.
That's quite something. The actions to guarantee one future were literally fueled by the fear of the other. But even inside this gilded cage, did the sources suggest Siddhartha was just, passively enjoying the luxury? Or were there hints of the person he'd become?
Yes, definitely hints. Even in that sheltered world, the sources describe the young Siddhartha as being, while unusually intelligent, very sensitive, observant, thoughtful, not just swept away by the pleasures.
Are there specific examples, like little stories?
There are some accounts, yeah. Stories about him showing compassion towards animals, for instance, even as a boy, which suggests a kind of innate sensitivity to others' pain, even before he saw human suffering directly.
Right, and I think I remember reading something about him being quite contemplative, even back then.
Exactly. There are these tales of the young prince maybe sitting quietly, meditating almost, perhaps under a tree while other kids were playing. It points to this natural tendency towards introspection,
Yeah.
a deeper way of looking at things.
Like the seeds were already there.
It suggests that, that maybe his future path wasn't just about what he eventually saw, but also about something inherent in his nature, even fostered in that quiet, protected space.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. We've got the royal birth, the prophecy hanging over him, this incredibly protective, maybe even isolating upbringing, and then these early signs of a really sensitive, thoughtful kid. How do the sources connect this early life in Kapilavastu to the huge journey he takes later?
Well, they suggest it created this unique foundation. On one hand, being shielded meant that when he did finally encounter suffering, the impact was maybe much more profound, more shocking.
Because he had no context for it.
Perhaps. And the prophecy itself, just by existing, introduced the idea of these two starkly different paths. Maybe it planted a question in his mind long before he left the palace.
Interesting.
And those glimpses, we mentioned the compassion, the quiet contemplation, the sources present these as foreshadowing. Hints that the wisdom he'd later find wasn't solely created by his experiences outside the palace, but was also something, innate, something that peculiar childhood perhaps inadvertently nurtured.
It's almost like the king's massive effort to control fate, to prevent him seeing suffering, somehow made his son's underlying sensitivity to it even more apparent.
That's the real paradox that kind of leaps out from the source material, isn't it?
Yeah. So we've really explored quite a bit here from the sources. That extraordinary birth, the prophecies, the really intense protective upbringing aimed at avoiding suffering, and yet those early signs of his innate sensitivity and contemplative nature.
And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about that paradox? How can a life so carefully designed to avoid the topic of suffering actually become the perfect setup for a life dedicated to understanding it and trying to end it?
Right. The sources show us the king trying so hard to push Siddhartha down one road by, hiding the map to the other road. So what does it really mean that those very conditions, the shielding, the luxury intended for a worldly destiny, seemed instead to just highlight his natural sensitivity and point towards the completely different spiritual path he ultimately chose? Definitely something to think about after this deep dive.